Identify threat events. Task 2-2. Identify potential threat events, relevance of the events, and the threat sources that could initiate the events. Supplemental guidance. Threat events are characterized by the threat sources that could initiate the events, and for adversarial events, the TTPs used to carry out attacks. Organizations define these threat events with sufficient detail to accomplish the purpose of the risk assessment. At Tier 1, threat events that could affect the organizational level are of particular interest. At Tier 2, threat events that cross or span information system boundaries, exploit functional dependencies or connectivity among systems, or affect mission or business owners are of particular interest. In Tier 3, threat events that can be described in terms of specific information systems, technologies, or environments of operation are of particular interest. Multiple threat sources can initiate a single threat event. Conversely, a single threat source can potentially initiate any of multiple threat events. Therefore, there can be a many-to-many relationship among threat events and threat sources that can potentially increase the complexity of the risk assessment. To enable effective use and communication of risk assessment results, organizations tailored general descriptions of threat events in tables E2 and E3 to identify how each event could potentially harm organizational operations, including mission, functions, image, or reputation, and assets, individuals, other organizations, or the nation. For each threat event identified, organizations determine the relevance of the event. Table E4 provides a range of values for relevance of threat events. The values selected by organizations have a direct linkage to organizational risk tolerance. The more risk averse, the greater the range of values considered. Organizations accepting greater risk or having a greater risk tolerance are more likely to require substantive evidence before giving serious consideration to threat events. If a threat event is deemed to be irrelevant, no further consideration is given. For relevant threat events, organizations identify all potential threat sources that could initiate the events. For use in Task 2-4, organizations can identify each parent of threat source and the threat event separately, since the likelihood of threat initiation and success could be different for each parent. Alternatively, organizations can identify the set of all possible threat sources that could potentially initiate a threat event. Appendix E provides a set of exemplary tables for use in identifying threat events. Table E1 provides a set of exemplary inputs to the threat event identification task. Table E2 provides representative examples of adversarial threat events expressed as TTPs. Table E3 provides representative examples of non-adversarial threat events. Table E4 provides exemplary values for the relevance of threat events to organizations, and Table E5 provides a template for summarizing and documenting the results of threat event identification. The information produced in Task 2-2 provides threat event inputs to the risk tables in Appendix I. Summary of key activities. Task 2-2. Identify threat event inputs. See Table E1 as tailored by the organization. Identify threat events. See Table E2 for adversarial threat events and Table E3 for non-adversarial threat events as tailored by the organization. Create or update Table E5. Identify threat sources that could initiate the threat events. See Table D7 and D8 as tailored by the organization. Update Table E5. Assess the relevance of threat events to the organization. See Table E4 as tailored by the organization. Update Table E5. Update columns 1-6 in Table I5 for adversarial risk. See Table E5 and Table D7, or update columns 1-4 in Table I7 for non-adversarial risk. See Table E5 and Table D8. Identify vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions. Task 2-3. Identify vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions that affect the likelihood that threat events of concern result in adverse impacts. Supplemental guidance. The primary purpose of vulnerability assessment is to understand the nature and degree to which organizations, mission, or business processes, and information systems are vulnerable to threat sources identified in Task 2-1 and the threat events identified in Task 2-2 that can be initiated by those threat sources. Vulnerabilities at Tier 1 can be pervasive across organizations and can have wide-ranging adverse impacts if exploited by threat events. For example, organizational failure to consider supply chain activities can result in organizations acquiring subverted components that adversaries could exploit to disrupt organizational mission or business functions or to obtain sensitive organizational information. Vulnerabilities at Tier 2 can be described in terms of organizational mission or business processes, enterprise architecture, the use of multiple information systems or common infrastructures or shared services. At Tier 2, vulnerabilities typically cross or span information system boundaries. Vulnerabilities at Tier 3 can be described in terms of the information technologies employed within organizational information systems, the environments in which those systems operate, and or the lack of weaknesses in system-specific security controls. There is potentially a many-to-many relationship between threat events and vulnerabilities. Multiple threat events can exploit a single vulnerability, and conversely, multiple vulnerabilities can be exploited by a single threat event. The severity of a vulnerability is an assessment of the relative importance of mitigating such a vulnerability. Initially, the extent to which mitigation is unplanned can serve as a surrogate for vulnerability severity. Once the risks associated with a particular vulnerability have been assessed, the impact, severity, and exposure of the vulnerability, given the security controls implemented and other vulnerabilities, can be taken into consideration in assessing vulnerability severity. Assessments of vulnerability severity support risk response. Vulnerabilities can be identified at varying degrees of granularity and specificity. The level of detail provided in any particular vulnerability assessment is consistent with the purpose of the risk assessment and the type of inputs needed to support following likelihood and impact determinations. Due to the ever-increasing size and complexity of organizations, mission and business processes, and their information systems supporting those processes, the number of vulnerabilities tends to be large and can increase the overall complexity of the analysis. Therefore, organizations have the option of using the vulnerability identification task to understand the general nature of the vulnerabilities, including scope, number, and type, relevant to the assessment. See Task 1-3, and performing a cataloging of specific vulnerabilities as necessary to do so. Organizations determine which vulnerabilities are relevant to which threat events in order to reduce the space of potential risks to be assessed. In addition to identifying vulnerabilities, organizations also identify any predisposing conditions which may affect susceptibility to certain vulnerabilities. Predisposing conditions that exist within organizations, including mission or business processes, information systems, and environment of operation, can contribute to, for example, increase or decrease the likelihood that one or more threat events, once initiated by threat sources, result in adverse impacts to organizational operations, organizational assets, individuals, other organizations, or the nations. Organizations determine which predisposing conditions are relevant to which threat events in order to reduce the space of potential risks to be assessed. Organizations assess the pervasiveness of predisposing conditions to support determination of the tiers at which risk response could be most effective. Appendix F provides a set of exemplary tables for use in identifying vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions. Table F1 provides a set of exemplary inputs to the vulnerability and predisposing condition identification task. Table F2 provides an exemplary assessment scale for assessing the severity of identified vulnerabilities. Table F3 provides a template for summarizing or documenting the results of vulnerability identification. Table F4 provides an exemplary taxonomy that can be used to identify and characterize predisposing conditions. Table F5 provides an exemplary assessment scale for assessing the pervasiveness of predisposing conditions. And Table F6 provides a template for summarizing or documenting the results of identifying predisposing conditions. The information produced in Task 2-3 provides vulnerability and predisposing condition inputs to the risk tables in Appendix I. Summary of key activities. Task 2-3. Identify vulnerability and predisposing condition inputs. See Table F1 as tailored by the organization. Identify vulnerabilities using organization-defined information sources. Create or update Table F3. Assess the severity of identified vulnerabilities. See Table F2 as tailored by the organization. Update Table F3. Identify predisposing conditions. See Table F4 as tailored by the organization. Create or update Table F6. Assess the pervasiveness of predisposing conditions. See Table F5 as tailored by the organization. Update Table F6. Update column 8 in Table I5 for adversarial risk, or update column 6 in Table I7 for non-adversarial risk. See Table F3 and Table F6. Update column 9 in Table I5 for adversarial risk. Update column 7 in Table I7 for non-adversarial risk. See Table F2 and Table F5. Determine likelihood. Task 2-4. Determine the likelihood that threat events of concern result in adverse impacts, considering first, the characteristics of the threat sources that could initiate the events, second, the vulnerabilities or predisposing conditions identified, and third, the organizational susceptibility reflecting the safeguards or countermeasures planned or implemented to impede such events. Supplemental guidance. Organizations employ a three-step process to determine the overall likelihood of threat events. First, organizations assess the likelihood that threat events will be initiated for adversarial threat events or will occur for non-adversarial threat events. Second, organizations assess the likelihood that threat events, once initiated or occurring, will result in adverse impacts to organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, or the nation. Finally, organizations assess the overall likelihood as a combination of likelihood of initiation or occurrence and likelihood of resulting in adverse impact. Organizations assess the likelihood of threat event initiation by taking into consideration the characteristics of the threat sources of concern, including capability, intent, and targeting. See Task 2-1 and Appendix D. If threat events require more capability than adversaries possess, and adversaries are cognizant of this fact, then the adversaries are not expected to initiate the events. If adversaries do not expect to achieve intended objectives by executing threat events, then the adversaries are not expected to initiate the events. And finally, if adversaries are not actively targeting specific organizations or their mission or business functions, adversaries are not expected to initiate threat events. Organizations use the assessment scale in Table G2 and provide a rationale for the assessment, allowing explicit consideration of deterrence and threat shifting. Organizations can assess the likelihood of threat event occurrence, non-adversarial, using Table G3 and provide a similar rationale for the assessment. Organizations assess the likelihood that threat events result in adverse impacts by taking into consideration the set of identified vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions. See Task 2-3 and Appendix F. For threat events initiated by adversaries, organizations consider characteristics of associated threat sources. For non-adversarial threat events, organizations take into account the anticipated severity and duration of the event, as included in the description of the event. Organizations use the assessment scale in Table G4 and provide a rationale for the assessment allowing explicit consideration as stated above. Threat events for which no vulnerabilities or predisposing conditions are identified have a very low likelihood of resulting in adverse impacts. Such threat events can be highlighted and moved to the end of the table or to a separate table so that they can be tracked for consideration in follow-on risk assessments. However, no further consideration during the current assessment is warranted. The overall likelihood of a threat event is a combination of, first, the likelihood that the event will occur, for example due to human error or natural disaster, or be initiated by an adversary, and second, the likelihood that the initiation or occurrence will result in adverse impacts. Organizations assess the overall likelihood of threat events by using inputs from tables G2, G3, and G4. Any specific algorithm or rule for combining the determined likelihood values depends on, first, a general organizational attitudes toward risk, including overall risk tolerance and tolerance for uncertainty. Second, specific tolerances toward uncertainty in different risk factors. And third, organizational weighting of risk factors. For example, organizations could use any of the following rules or could define a different rule. First, use the maximum of the two likelihood values. Second, use the maximum of the two likelihood values. Third, consider likelihood of initiation or occurrence only, assuming that if threat events are initiated or occur, the events will result in adverse impacts. Fourth, consider likelihood of impact only, assuming that if threat events could result in adverse impacts, adversaries will initiate the events. Fifth, take a weighted average of the two likelihood values. Organizations may explicit the rules used. Appendix G provides a set of exemplary tables for use in determining likelihood of threat events. Table G1 provides a set of exemplary inputs to the likelihood determination task. Table G2 provides an exemplary assessment scale for assessing the likelihood of initiation for adversarial threat events. Table G3 provides an exemplary assessment scale for assessing the likelihood of non-adversarial threat events occurring. Table G4 provides an exemplary assessment scale for assessing the likelihood of threat events having adverse impacts if the events are initiated adversarial or occur non-adversarial. And Table G5 provides an exemplary assessment scale for assessing the overall likelihood of threat events. This is a combination of the likelihood of initiation or occurrence and the likelihood of impact. The information produced in Task 2-4 provides threat event likelihood inputs to the risk tables in Appendix I. Summary of key activities, Task 2-4. Identify likelihood determination inputs, see Table G1 as tailored by the organization. Identify likelihood determination factors using organization-defined information sources, for example, threat source characteristics, vulnerabilities, predisposing conditions. Assess the likelihood of threat event initiation for adversarial threats and the likelihood of threat event occurrence for non-adversarial threats. See Table G2 and Table G3 as tailored by the organization. Assess the likelihood of threat events resulting in adverse impacts, given likelihood of initiation of occurrence. See Table G4 as tailored by the organization. Assess the overall likelihood of threat event initiation or occurrence and likelihood of threat events resulting in adverse impacts. See Table G5 as tailored by the organization. Update columns 7, 10, and 11 in Table I5 for adversarial risk. See Table G2, Table G4, and Table G5, or update columns 5, 8, and 9 in Table I7 for non-adversarial risk. See Table G3, Table G4, and Table G5. Determine impact. Task 2-5. Determine the adverse impacts from threat events of concern, considering first the characteristics of the threat sources that could initiate the events, second the vulnerabilities or predisposing conditions identified, and third the susceptibility reflecting the safeguards or countermeasures planned or implemented to impede such events. Supplemental guidance. Organizations describe adverse impacts in terms of the potential harm caused by the organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, or the nation, where the threat event occurs and whether the effects of the event contained or spread influences the severity of the impact. Assessing impact can involve identifying assets or potential targets of threat sources, including information resources, for example, information, data repositories, information systems, applications, information technologies, communications links, people and physical resources, for example, buildings, power supplies, which could be affected by threat events. Organizational impacts are defined and prioritized at tiers 1 and 2 and communicated to tier 3 as part of risk framing. At tier 3, impacts are associated with information system capabilities, for example, processing, display, communications, storage, and retrieval, and resources, for example, databases, services, components that could be compromised. Appendix H provides a set of exemplary tables for use in determining adverse impacts. Table H1 provides a set of exemplary inputs to the impact determination task. Table H2 provides representative examples of adverse impacts to organizations focusing on harm to organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation. Table H3 provides an exemplary assessment scale for assessing the impact of threat events, and Table H4 provides a template for summarizing or documenting adverse impacts. The information produced in Task 2-5 provides adverse impact inputs that are risk tables in Appendix 1. Summary of key activities. Task 2-5. Identify impact determination inputs. See Table H1 as tailored by the organization. Identify impact determination factors using organization-defined information sources. Identify adverse impacts and affected assets. See Table H2 as tailored by the organization. Create or update Table H4. Assess the maximum impact associated with the affected assets. See Table H3 as tailored by the organization. Update Table H4. Update column 12 in Table I5 for adversarial risk, or update column 10 in Table I7 for non-adversarial risk. Determine risk. Task 2-6. Determine the risk to the organization from threat events of concern, considering first the impact that would result from the events, and second the likelihood of the events occurring. Supplemental guidance. Organizations assess the risks from threat events as a combination of likelihood and impact. The level of risk associated with identified threat events represents a determination of the degree to which organizations are threatened by such events. Organizations may explicit the uncertainty in the risk determinations, including, for example, organizational assumptions and subjective judgments or decisions. Organizations can order the list of threat events of concern by the level of risk determined during the risk assessment, with the greatest attention going to high-risk events. Organizations can further prioritize risks at the same level or with similar scores. See Appendix J. Each risk corresponds to a specific threat event with a level of impact if the event occurs. In general, the risk level is typically not higher than the impact level, and likelihood can serve to reduce risk below the impact level. However, when addressing organization-wide risk management issues with a large number of missions or business functions, mission or business processes, and supporting information systems, impact as an upper bound on risk may not hold. For example, when multiple risks materialize, even if each risk is at the moderate level. The set of those moderate level risks could aggregate to a higher level of risk for organizations. To address situations where harm occurs multiple times, organizations can define a threat event as multiple occurrences of harm and an impact level associated with the cumulative degree of harm during the execution of tasks 2-1 through 2-5. Organizations capture key information related to uncertainties in risk assessments. These uncertainties arise from sources such as mission information, subjective determinations, and assumptions made. The effectiveness of risk assessment results is in part determined by the ability of decision makers to be able to determine the continued applicability of assumptions made as part of the assessment. Information related to uncertainty is compiled and presented in a manner that readily supports informed risk management decisions. Appendix 1 provides a set of exemplary tables for use in determining risk. Table I1 provides a set of exemplary inputs to the risk and uncertainty determination task. Table I2 and I3 provide exemplary assessment scales for assessing levels of risk. Table I4 and I6 provide descriptions of column headings for key data elements used in risk determinations for adversarial and non-adversarial threat events, respectively, and tables I5 and I7 provide templates for summarizing or documenting key data elements used in risk determinations for adversarial and non-adversarial threat events, respectively. The information produced in Task 2-6 provides risk inputs to the risk tables in Appendix I. Summary of key activities, Task 2-6. Identify risk and uncertainty determination inputs, see Table I1, as tailored by the organization. Determine risk, see Table I2 and Table I3, as tailored by the organization. Update column 13 in Table I5 for adversarial risk in column 11, in Table I7 for non-adversarial risk.